All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know where you're at, but this week we are going to be talking about angles. Okay, and we're going to start talking about angles by talking about angle relationships. Now, if you recall, the other day we were talking about just what parallel lines mean and what an angle is. Okay, so we're going to build on that a little bit and we're going to talk about different relationships that these angles have. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in. And we're going to start by just looking at an angle. Okay, now if you recall, an angle is made up of two lines. Okay, so we have two lines here. So we're going to have one line and then another line right there. And these could be any two lines, and it doesn't really matter. And these create an angle. Okay, so they actually create four angles. And so there's one. We're going to call this I don't know, A. We'll just call it A, just for right now. And then here, we have another one on this side. And we're going to call that B. Okay, now, please remember a couple of things. When these lines cross, they create something called a vertex. And that vertex is the point where the two lines meet. And that's where it creates the angle. It's like a hinge on a door. Okay, so that hinge is called a vertex. And that's super important because if you have an angle on one side of the vertex and with the same two lines, you create an angle on the other side of the vertex, and they have to be opposite one another. Those two angles have a relationship to each other. Those are called vertical angles. Those are called vertical angles. Okay, so if I had a letter here on the vertex, let's say we had M here on the vertex. So this point was point M, and I had O here, G there. Let's go L and E. Then remember, we can use the three letters to name the angle. So we could say angle OMG and angle LME are vertical angles. Okay, so angle OMG, so we start at O, go through M, up to G. So this part that we labeled A, and then LME, the part that we labeled B, those two are vertical angles. Okay, and that's going to be important later because when we start talking about what these relationships mean, then we get into some really good stuff. So for right now, we can say that A angle, this angle that we labeled A, this angle that we labeled B, they are vertical angles. Now, let's not get it twisted. They have to be opposite one another. If I look at this angle here, and I call that angle C, these two are not vertical, nor are these two vertical. It can't be side to side. They cannot share a side. They have to be directly opposite one another. Okay, so A and B are vertical angles. Okay? So that's one kind of relationship that we can have. Now, another kind of relationship that we can have doesn't have just two lines. It actually has what we talked about before, or the other day, with two two parallel lines. Okay, and the rest of the angle relationships that we're going to talk about have to do with two vertical lines, or sorry, not vertical lines, sorry, two parallel lines, and they are cut by a transversal. Okay, so they're cut by a transversal. Kind of like the railroad tracks being cut by a road. Okay, because remember, these have to be parallel in order for this to work. They have to be parallel, friend zone. They have to be parallel. So I'm going to pick a random angle here. I'm going to call that angle A. Now we can use the 3-letter definition or the 3-letter name, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to use A. Now, if you notice here, let's say imagine that these are 2 streets and this is a 3rd street going through them. This corner right here is the upper left corner of this intersection. Okay, if you were talking about streets, this would be an intersection. And this upper left corner is where we put our angle. Well, if I look down here, if I looked at the upper left corner of the intersection and called that B, those two are the same. Those two are absolutely the same. So they're the same upper left corner of the intersection, which means that they like if I look at this one, it corresponds to the position over here. So the position of this one corresponds to the position of that one. So when they're like this and they're both in the same upper left corner, or it could be upper right or lower left, but if they're in the same relative position, we call those corresponding angles. Corresponding angles. Okay. Now, A and B are corresponding angles. If I were to look here, C, upper right, and upper right, D, upper right, those are also corresponding angles. Okay, as long as the position, the relative position is the same, then they are corresponding angles. And the important thing is that these two are actually the same angle, just on a different line. Okay, they have the same measure. Okay? Just like the vertical angles, these are actually going to have the same measure as well. These two right here. Those are going to have the same measure. They're going to be the same angle, just with different letters. And that's kind of the whole point. All of the angles that we're going to be talking about, all of the angle pairs, all the pairs of angles, they're all going to be congruent. So they're all going to have the same measure. It's just the relationship that we use, or the relationship that they have to each other, make them congruent. Okay, so corresponding angles. So again, these are corresponding angles right here. A, B are corresponding angles, and then similarly, C and D are corresponding angles. Okay. All right, now again, we're back to the 2 parallel lines. Now these parallel lines can go anywhere. So I could have my parallel lines going straight up and down if I wanted to. Or that way. That works too. As long as they're parallel, that's all that matters. And then they're cut by a transversal. Now, for the next two, we're going to be talking about alternate or same side, and then interior or exterior. Okay, so if I look inside here, in between the parallel lines, that's kind of in the interior, okay, kind of like you're in a house. If you talk about the inside, like interior design, then you're talking about the inside of the house. If we talk about the exterior, we're talking about the outside of the house. Okay, so imagine that your house is defined by the parallel lines. We're going to be talking about a pair of angles on the interior, or we could be talking about a pair of angles on the exterior. Okay, so if I were to look at 2 angles on the interior, specifically these 2 angles right here, let's go with this angle, we'll call that A, and here we'll call this one B. So these 2 angles that are on the interior, they're going to be the same as long as they're on alternate sides of the transversal. So these 2 angles will be the same if they're in the interior of the parallel lines and on alternate sides of the transversal. So the relationship of those are alternate interior angles. Alternate interior angles. Alternate because they're on opposite sides of the transversal. Interior because they're on the inside of the parallel lines. Okay, so A and B are the same. They're congruent if they are on alternate sides of the transversal and on the interior of the parallel lines. Okay, so alternate interior angles. Okay, now remember, the whole goal is to come up with relationships that cause the angles to be congruent. Okay, so alternate interior. Now, I also said that we were going to be talking about some exterior stuff. So let's go two parallel lines, and I'm going to make these parallel lines go this way. So these parallel lines are going to go this way. And then the transversal is going to go this way. Okay, because as long as the lines are parallel, it doesn't really matter which way the transversal goes. Okay, and that's going to create a couple of angles. Let's go with this angle right here. We'll call that A. And then this angle out here, we'll call that B. Now, if you notice, they're not on the interior anymore. They're not on the inside of the parallel lines. They're on the outside. And so they are considered exterior angles. Exterior angles. Now, luckily for us, they're still on opposite sides of the transversal. This one's kind of on the bottom, that one's kind of on the top. So they are still alternate. Okay? So these angles are going to be the same because they are alternate exterior angles. Alternate exterior angles. That's their relationship to each other. Okay, so they're on the outside of the parallel lines on opposite sides of the transversal. Okay, so we have four angle relationships that we're going to be talking about. We have vertical, where they're on opposite sides of the vertex. They are congruent. We have corresponding, where we have two parallel lines cut by a transversal, and they're in the same relative position for each intersection. Same relative position for each intersection, like upper left or upper right or bottom left, bottom right. Okay, they both have to have the same relative position. Alternate interior means they're both on the inside of the parallel lines on opposite sides of the transversal. And then finally, alternate exterior, they're both on the outside of the parallel lines on opposite sides of the transversal. So we've got some examples here. If you want to do these, go ahead and pause and then try to name or identify the relationships that these have to each other. Okay, try to identify those relationships. So go ahead and pause. I'll give you a second to do it. Okay, good. So you paused and now you've had a second. So looking at these two, they're on opposite sides of the vertex. So these are vertical. These are vertical angles. Okay, here, let's see, we've got parallel lines and a transversal. This is kind of on the left, upper left, and this is also on the upper left. So they are corresponding. They're in the same relative position. Here, they're both on the inside of the parallel lines. They're both on the inside of the parallel lines on opposite sides of the transversal. So these are alternate interior angles. Okay, because alternate opposite sides of the transversal, both on the inside of the parallel lines. Here, still opposite sides of the transversal, but now they're both on the outside of the parallel lines, These would be alternate exterior angles. So alternate interior on the inside, alternate exterior on the outside. Well, there you go. So this is going to be what you're going to be working on. Please make sure that you're doing the practice, do the check for understanding, and then your assessment will be during your Zoom time during the week. All right? Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and please stay safe.